welcome you to the Healthy Communities Initiative, Telling Your Story. I have just a few housekeeping items before we start. All of your phone lines are muted to reduce the background noise. Please make sure to use your audio pin so that your lines can be unmuted to participate in the discussion. Also, please make sure your computer speakers are turned off or muted to help eliminate any background noise. We have posted the webinar slides on the HCI SharePoint calendar, so should you want to print them off and take notes, you can find them there. They're also located under Resources in the HCI Webinar Slides and Documents folder. Finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be archived on SharePoint within a few days. We'll go ahead and start with a short slide presentation, and time will be set aside for questions and discussion. Please feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat box on the right side of your screen. At the end, Sean will close with announcements about some upcoming events and due dates. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Adrienne. Welcome, HCI communities, and Happy New Year. This is our first webinar of the 2015, and I think you'll enjoy this presentation. Melinda Lewis has her master's degree from the University of Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and she is an associate professor of practice in the School of Social Welfare at the University of Kansas. We know Melinda from a project that we've worked on with several of other Kansas grant makers, and that's on building advocacy, evaluation capacity in Kansas, especially working with statewide advocacy organizations in Kansas. Many of them are close partners. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeff and Adrienne. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to get to talk with you all. Wish always that I could see people's faces, but it's really rare for me to have a chance to talk with folks who are doing such fantastic work all around the state, and very grateful for technology that makes it feasible for us to do that. As Sean said, we would encourage you to use the chat not only to ask questions, but if there are additional comments that you want to make or things that you want to follow up on more, I certainly would be happy to use some of the time that we'll have at the end to dive more deeply into areas that are of particular interest. As well, I'll close with my contact information. As Jeff said, in addition to my responsibilities at the university, I do provide advocacy and advocacy evaluation support to many nonprofit and community-based organizations in Kansas and Missouri, and would always be happy to talk with folks about how you can be strengthened in your ability to drive your very good work forward in your community. So if we run out of time to address some of the challenges that you're facing around communication or even other aspects of your advocacy and community change work as a part of this webinar, certainly would be delighted to continue that conversation otherwise. What I'm going to share with you today, and hopefully then we'll have some conversation about it here in just a little while, is about how strategic communications can increase your ability to bring others into your work, to activate those constituencies, to cultivate champions who will then help you do the work that you know your community needs, and really in support of creating the types of communities and the vision that you have for what health looks like in your particular part of Kansas. So this is about communications, but not so much kind of more narrowly about your media work or your marketing, although certainly those are ways that we communicate, but really about helping you think through what is it that you want to share, what is your message, what are your communications aims, and how can you use different elements of your organizational, coalition, and overall change capacity to drive that work forward. So we're going to start with just kind of an overview to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what we hope to accomplish together in the next hour or so, about helping you at least lay the foundation for refining your message for communicating your Healthy Communities Initiative work. This isn't about spin, so I think sometimes those of us who are deeply invested in doing authentic grassroots community change work can get a little nervous with the idea that we're going to go forth with a particular, quote, message, because that sounds like we're trying to sell folks something. And certainly there is an element of persuasion involved in strategic communications, but it's really about shaping how people see their world, the needs, and your work, so that then they will be more likely to walk with you on the change journey that you're charting in your communities. So we're not talking about anything that is inauthentic or less than totally honest with our communities, but really just helping you get better at communicating what it is people need to know about their community and what you can do together in it. Talking then about how storytelling fits within that strategic communication approach, really how storytelling complements data collection and data dissemination as a part of your overall communications approach. Helping you to familiarize yourself with some of the tools that are available for cultivating and curating effective stories for advocacy. So getting the stories that you need and then figuring out what to do with what you've got. Certainly, what I'll talk with you about today is not the only way that you could approach that story collection and story curation and deployment process, but they are tools that a lot of organizations with which I've worked, not just in Kansas and Missouri, but to some extent around the country, have found helpful. So maybe you'll be able to apply them kind of as discussed today, or maybe they'll really be a launching point for you digging some more, and then I'd certainly be happy to help you uncover some additional resources that would be useful. And then being inspired by some other examples of effective communication as a tool for social and community change. I have some examples that I'm going to include at a couple of different points throughout the presentation, and that's where, again, we would ask you also to use that chat box to share some of your examples of work that you're doing in your community as the Kansas Health Foundation and the folks who are supporting the HCI work continue to help you lift up the very good messages and stories that you have to share. So we're going to start with kind of thinking about the fact that, there's really no such thing as the, quote, best or right message or communications approach. What you will do depends on what it is that you want to accomplish. And so I just want to ask folks, particularly those of you who have a couple of you huddled around a telephone or a computer, to think a little bit and then maybe to make some plans to think more together in the future about what are your communications goals? What are it that you're trying to get people to understand about your work? Even I work a lot with organizations and ask them to think like, when you're at a party or, if you're like me waiting in line to pick your kids up from something, and somebody says, what's going on in your coalition, or what are you working on, or what is it you do? What do you say? What do you sometimes think later you wish you would have said? What is that message that you really want to leave people with about what you're doing and why it matters? Who are the audiences with the most influence over your success? So who is it who you need to convince or start a conversation with or enter into some sort of a communication exchange with? Policymakers primarily, employers, educators, even, and I get this a lot from groups, even if you think kind of, it's just the, quote, general public, who in the public is it? Who are the constituencies who you think most, they are our people. They just maybe don't know it yet, and we need to figure out the right messages to use to approach them. What kinds of pressures are those audiences facing, and what messages will resonate most with them? What do you need to communicate then about how your policy success will help your key audiences deal with what they care about most? We are most successful in communicating when we, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about messages and stories that work, when we don't have to spend a lot of energy convincing people that they care about our work. All we have to do, we are most successful when what we have to do is convince them that what we're doing connects with what it is they already care about, whether that's how their kids are doing in school, or how often their employees are absent, or how much healthcare costs in our community. What do you most want people to understand about this particular element of your work? And then how can you use stories, use data, use messages and framing to drive toward that understanding that you want to leave people with? What message do you want them to take away? And that's where, again, I encourage people often to think about those elevator conversations. You're not necessarily trying to come up with a soundbite here. And in fact, the message that you want to leave people with may not be anything you ever say in so many words, but it's the overall impression toward which you want your communications efforts to drive. And so then thinking about defining for yourself what success looks like in this case. Here I just want to ask, and if anybody wants to type a comment or a response into the chat box, that would be great. But I say in all sincerity, not just because the folks from the Kansas Health Foundation are on the phone, but I have never seen a community change initiative that comes with this much attention to and this many resources for strategic communications. KHSF has provided a lot there for folks to use. And so I'm interested in, for those who have used some of the communications tools that the Kansas Health Foundation has provided to help you craft messages, and then particularly there is a lot there on how to deploy those messages in the media environment and other contexts. Have you seen this communications work result in any improved attention to or resonance of your messages? So anything that folks would be willing to type in and share. We've intended to do this as a poll and encountered some technical difficulties. So I know it'll take people a while to type if they're willing to do that. And if you don't have anything to share now, I would certainly encourage you to look at those resources that the Health Foundation has, and then to think about how would you define success and what could you track. I'm not talking about some really sophisticated evaluation plan, but what matters to you, and what could you track to see how your communications efforts move the needle there. So maybe it's attendance at some of your events, and you think that if you could do a better job getting the word out when you have events coming up, you could get more people there. Maybe it's the quantity or the quality of your media coverage. Maybe it's the number of people who are willing to come and share their stories in front of a city council or with potential donors. Maybe it's the number of people who are using a new trail or an exercise facility where, again, from talking with folks that those who use those investments are very satisfied with them, and so your sense is that what you have that may be depressing utilization is an awareness issue. What would success look like to you around your communications, and how can you use some of those foundation-provided tools to help with that? And then what questions might you ask yourself to figure out how successful you are being? So I'm going to pause for just a minute to give anybody who wants to type something in, either a response or some thoughts or questions, a chance to do that. And then we will move to looking at kind of some more self-assessment that you might use to start this process.
Okay, and we do have a couple of questions here.
Great.
While this is open. When a person or organization that is not directly related to our initiative talks about it in the media and asks a question, and then the other comment is number of policymakers who are willing to attend our workshops and events.
Yep.
Another comment is when we leadership team members get invitations to go speak to other groups.
Yeah, great. So just want to pick up on those a little bit. Those are fantastic examples. So that first element is really about other people becoming messengers for you and picking up your frame. And that is, in fact, a metric that I use with a lot of organizations. We're going to talk a minute about why messengers matter. But certainly we know from empirical evidence and looking at advocacy and communications campaigns that when you can get other people to champion your issues for you, that has tremendous salience, and it also has the very practical advantage of increasing the number of folks, the kind of foot soldiers, so to speak, that you have driving that work forward. And really all three of these really relate to kind of opportunities to get other folks to help you drive your work forward. So policymakers attending, that to me suggests that your communications has not only resulted in helping other people to engage with your work, but you have also changed some of the political calculus around your work such that it is a perceived advantage for public officials to be associated with what you're doing, or perhaps, and perhaps just as importantly, a perceived disadvantage for them not to be a part of those conversations. And then when leadership is invited to speak to and engage with other organizations, there are two elements there. One is that it gives you access to other communications venues. So you're not just getting invited, you're getting invited to go and do more good communications work in those environments in a way that can expand your communications landscape. But it also suggests that other folks are buying into the idea that your work has resonance for theirs as well. Anything else, Sean, that folks wanted to lift up?
And just wanted to give you the results of that poll. 89% said yes and 11% said no.
Okay, great. So good. I'm glad that there is as much utilization of some of those really, again, fantastic materials, and I certainly would encourage those who haven't had a chance to talk through those with board members and staff and volunteers to do so. It's really, again, fairly rare for a community change effort to be able to draw on communications tools that were created with their specific context in mind. We spend a lot of time kind of trying to figure out what fits and what doesn't fit from things that we've had to borrow elsewhere. So that's a tremendous advantage for you. That's great. So then let's talk a little bit specifically about messaging. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of why message matters and then what you're really going to be looking for in terms of messages, what makes a good message. So again, thinking first that we start with this kind of self-assessment, understanding that we don't communicate on a blank slate. We're not walking into a message vacuum. People already have things that they think about the work that you're doing, and so your communications will be most successful if you approach those efforts with an eye to what people are already saying and to the extent to which you can figure it out what they already think about the issues that you're working on. Oftentimes, I think we develop this message and then we drive it forward without enough attention to listening to what the conversation looks like as we enter midstream, or again to attending to some of those indicators that would suggest that we're having some interim success in reshaping those conversations. So where are you currently communicating? And I advise groups that aren't already doing it to do a kind of inventory. Your communications is not just the press releases you put out. It's the conversations that you have. It's a newsletter. It's your web presence if you have one. It's an email listserv that you have. It's minutes from your coalition meetings. So kind of thinking about every way that people might experience your organization and your message, and what are those different touch points saying to people. What is your frame for your current messages? And are those frames consistent? Especially in today's landscape of social media, where somebody who's in today's audience at the Rotary Club is likely interfacing in some way online with somebody at the city council or somebody who's going to be reading what we're talking about in the newspaper, or somebody who is going to be at another event that we have with a very different audience and perhaps a somewhat different message, but making sure that there is some internal consistency to that overall framing. How well do your messengers match your message, and then how well do your messages match your audience? You know, the who matters a lot. And one of the things I think that we often overlook in terms of our communications capacity is cultivating the right messengers. So thinking about who you might need to bring on to be one of the folks driving those messages forward. What evidence do you have that your frames or messages are penetrating? That gets to what we just talked about in terms of the indicators you might look to. And things like, you know, other folks are saying what we say for us are certainly tremendous examples of the evidence to which you might look. And then, you know, have you developed some messages for things that you anticipate you will need messages for? I work a lot with groups to help them see the value of planning for their future communications needs. These are things that you really don't want to have to create from scratch in real time. So things like, you know, I work a lot with groups and say, kind of, what's the worst case scenario that you can imagine having to communicate around, and how might you prepare for that? Maybe it's the loss of funding. Maybe it's a report that not as many people as you had expected have used a particular infrastructure improvements that you helped to create. Maybe it's data that come out that show that smoking rates have increased in your community. I don't know what that case would be, but thinking about kind of what do you hope, fingers crossed, you don't ever have to communicate around, and how might laying some foundation, developing some messages that you think could work even in that environment, help you not only to have greater resilience in that situation, but also lay the foundation for some successful communication, period. And you're not always planning for worst case scenario. You know, also thinking about, you know, do you have messages that you use with potential donors or people who say, I'm really interested in what you're doing. How can I help? I hear a lot from organizations, too, that say that they wish that they had anticipated the level of interest that would be piqued in their work, and then been better ready to give people very clear ways to connect. And we're going to talk about that more in just a minute when we talk about the particular kinds of stories that we're interested in being stories to help move people to action. So I want to think just a little bit now about kind of, you know, what you use messages for, and then I'm going to introduce some particular message tools that I've seen organizations use to great effect. So as you're thinking about different entry points, kind of different levers that you might use to improve your communications, it's not just your message, but certainly your message is often the place that you start. But looking at, you know, are the delivery vehicles that you're using versatile enough for the arenas in which you use them? So, you know, looking at, yes, your, you know, press releases and other kinds of media contacts, but also direct appeals, speakers bureaus, social media, kind of, are you using all of the different channels that you could potentially be using to maximum effect? Do your messages translate what you're expert in into what others can relate to? That's really your critical communications challenge, and it's particularly difficult for folks to tell for themselves. So one of the places that you can start in building your communications capacity is by cultivating a kind of kitchen cabinet, so to speak, finding some folks who care about your work but aren't deeply invested in it and certainly not experts in it, so that you can test some of your messages with them. You know, we tend to oftentimes talk to folks who see the world the way that we do, and not surprisingly then, we all think that we sound really great. And you need some safe but really honest people with whom you can have a conversation about, you know, are we really as good here as we think we are? Do your messages allow you to drive the narrative so that you don't get trapped in only responding to others' frames? And this means looking for opportunities to communicate, not waiting until they come to you. You know, you all, I'm sure, are beyond the point of kind of hoping the reporters don't call, which is where some of the groups with whom I work are. But even for us, it can get easy to get wrapped up in doing the work, and it's important work, and we're driving it forward, and sometimes forgetting that we need to always be looking for opportunities to tell more people and invite more people into conversation about that work. And then are your messages malleable enough that you can use them to tell your story in a variety of different contexts? I'm going to talk about message boxes and why they are particularly helpful, but one of the reasons is because of what they're not. They're not talking points. They're not points to memorize. They are tools to help you increase your skill in message development and message delivery, and you can then use that in a variety of different contexts. Do we have the poll, Sean, that we can do in terms of folks' top priority for improving their strategic communications? And if not, I'll just ask folks if anybody wants to chime in.
Sure. I'll go ahead and launch the question, what's your top priority for improving strategic communication?
Okay. Awesome. If folks can just click there, and if you fall into the other category, totally understand. If you're willing to type into the chat what that top communications priority is, that would be awesome.
And there are poll results. As you can see, 33% increased unity and message among coalition partners, and 44% more stories of community impact, and 22% more different messengers recruited.
Awesome. Great. So, and again, really not a wrong answer there, but important that the strategies that you prioritize drive toward those primary objectives that you have for your communications work. And so I would ask you to be kind of thinking, as we're spending the next 20 minutes or so talking about a couple of these different tools, to be thinking about how you could use them specifically with those aims in mind, because getting better, getting more intentional about your communications can do all of those things for you. So let's talk a little bit about message then. And I have some messages that have been developed by advocacy or nonprofit organizations with which I've had the privilege to work. But we're also going to ask here that if folks have messages that you're working on or messages that you're trying to push through your communications environment, that you use that chat box to share those with us. But what you'll see here is that, this message development is not about trying to say everything. It's not about trying to come up with a mission statement that captures the entirety of your work, but it is about finding themes that encompass the core of the work that organizations are doing. And the best messages adhere to some principles or kind of meet certain criteria. And so as I share what some of those criteria are, I would encourage you to think about the types of messages that you view as most effective, and what are their attributes? What is it about those messages that you think particularly resonate with you? And I often ask organizations to think about an organization whose position you don't share, but whose message you can really appreciate. Because again, sometimes we tend to be drawn to messages because they sound like something that we would have said, which doesn't always teach us as much as looking at those who have sometimes a very different orientation to the world, but whose skill in communications we can really appreciate. So as I talk about message boxes and why they help, to keep in mind the criteria that we're thinking about. So, and some of these are here. The best messages are authentic. They are messages that you would really use, that feel comfortable for you to say. This is where you get at greater unity among your coalition partners, because you are not expecting everyone to say exactly the same thing. Another one of the attributes of the best messages is that they are versatile, and they're not sound bites, they're not talking points. People can vary the words that they use, but they are conveying the same core content. The tagline that I encourage people to remember is that we're looking for unity, but not uniformity. This isn't about getting folks to memorize, a set of data points or a set of sound bites, but helping people to see how, if we're all using messages that share some similar values and similar attributes, we can help to bring people to the same core conclusion. The best messages are engaging, but they're not emotionally manipulative. Yes, we need to grab people's attention, but people also tend to be repelled by the messages that sound like the most extreme example, or those where they can tell that the messenger has kind of gone straight for the jugular, so to speak. The best messages similarly carry some element of hope, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the most effective stories, because a similar principle is at work there. But you're dealing with tough issues, and I work with organizations that are dealing with issues that are probably even more difficult to communicate around, those that work with child abuse and suicide prevention. But even there, if there isn't some element of hope or promise within your message, why would I, as an individual considering this issue or your organization, be moved in any way to affiliate with you? I will want to get as far away from that pathos as I possibly can. And so your challenge in constructing an effective message is to convey some urgency and certainly authenticity. And again, you're dealing with very serious issues where there is unauthentic urgency, but to do so in a way that does not sound entirely bleak, so that people see why they may want to be a part of your work. And then the best messages are those that are relevant and personal. Again, our challenge is to help people see that the work that you're doing connects with things that they already know they care about. And you have an inherent advantage in that you're communicating in your particular community where you live and work and know people, and there's a certain credibility and investedness that is conveyed there. So message boxes are tools that enforce and insist upon message discipline. You have 3 or 4 key subpoints as your evidence, and underneath each of those 3 or 4 points that you have, your message box is called a message box, but it can also be a message triangle, so that's where the 3 or the 4 come from. But it can't be 2, because then you don't have a robust enough message. It just tends to be too weak to bring along folks who may not be inclined to see the issue or your work from your perspective. And it can't be 6 or 8, because while we may wish otherwise, we have an abundance of cognitive research that tells us that people just can't keep that many different points in their minds. And I do an exercise when I'm doing more lengthy communications trainings with groups that try to get people to remember 8 or 10 things. And even when you're trying really hard because you want to prove that no, in fact, it's entirely possible for you to use these 11-point talking points that you came up with, you'll see that you just can't. So that's where we force people to really think about just the few points that they most want to leave people with. Again, they're not sound bites, they're versatile. You can pivot to any point on the message box in response to any opening, and they can be used by any messenger to adapt them to his or her emphasis and style and voice. I worked with a mental health organization over in Kansas City, Missouri, and they just told me a couple of weeks ago that they have the message boxes that they developed on a couple of the issues that they're working on laminated and actually put them over people's phones up on the walls of their office so that when they are talking with the media, certainly, but also with donors and with coalition partners, they can feel more confident in their ability to deliver that message because they can look at it visually and know that they can hop anywhere there and be saying something that's quote unquote on message. A lot of our anxiety about being misquoted is really just our grief over the times when we've said something that we didn't really mean to say, and that's what ended up being the dominant message, being what somebody remembered, being what some journalist wrote down or recorded. And while that is regrettable, it is much less likely to happen if you're using a tool that reminds you anything in this universe is essentially okay. Things that are out of it were left out of it for a reason, and it's not where you want to go in your conversation. Your message boxes aggregate so that the messages build on each other toward that coherent thesis. And again, that promotes the empowerment of your messengers. I'm much less hesitant to talk with someone publicly about this work if I don't feel responsible for memorizing a long set of talking points, nor expected to do this extemporaneously. If I am given a tool that reminds me, you can say any of these things, you can figure out what feels the best to you, but here is a roadmap to guide you in this conversation. That's what we know from empirical evidence increases individuals' willingness and effectiveness in a communications challenge. So how do you build a message box? And really, literally, you can take a piece of paper and draw a big cross in the middle of it so that you have 4 quadrants. Or if you're just a little bit better at spatial arrangements than I am, draw 2 lines so that you have 3 sections, and then you have a triangle. And you're going to start with a core or main message. This is what you really want people to be left with. And this is a little bit tricky for folks because you may not even say this. Right? You may, and in fact, I've had some organizations whose main message from their message box became a tagline on their business cards or became in some way incorporated into their mission statement, but maybe not. It may just be the kind of benchmark, the guidepost by which you assess then the sub-messages that you come up with. And you're going to craft those next, and I think that those are really, you should spend most of your time here. I guess I hesitate to say that any part is most important, but you're going to spend most of your time here because you really have to make sure that these are things that you want people to remember. So they have to be very memorable, but they also have to lead to that main message. So oftentimes you have more than 3 or 4 points that you want people to remember, and that's okay, except that you're going to need other message boxes then that drive toward different messages or even toward the same one, but perhaps with a different set of messengers or a different audience in mind, because you just can't have 6 or 8 in one message structure. Then you're going to use the evidence, you're going to list the evidence that you use to illustrate the inherent logic of those subpoints. What you're really aiming for here is to keep people with you and help them to reach the same conclusions that you've reached. They may take something from here away with them or they may not. What you want here are pieces of evidence, stories as well as data, statistics from your work, things that illustrate why your subpoints are true so that you arrive at the end of this piece of your communications and folks are basically thinking, oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, that makes sense. You want then the conclusions that you've reached to follow logically and consistently from those different evidence points. And then, and this is a key piece that we often miss, you revisit that overall message so that you're clear that the subpoints and the evidence that you've included do drive toward that overall message. I see organizations get tripped up here a lot. We have our favorite points, right? We have the story that we just can't forget, or we have the statistics that we think are just so compelling, and so we throw those in every time we get a chance to talk about our work, forgetting often that those may not be the best points or the best stories to really leave people with that ultimate message as we've identified as our objective at a particular point. So kind of looping back, it's okay if you get to the end and you think, oh, I'm not exactly making that point I thought I was going to. I really want to make this one. But you have to change then that initial message and not assume that people can leap with you from where your arguments lead them to where it was that you initially framed you wanted them to go. I want to pause right here, Sean, for just a minute, because we're going to pivot to talking about storytelling specifically for about the next 15 minutes, but I want to give folks a chance to put any questions that they have into that chat box, and we can either deal with them here or know what we've got to loop back to before we close out this afternoon.
There's nothing in the chat box or question box so far, but we'll give folks maybe another moment or so.
Okay, no problem. And we can always come back to those questions. We're at a kind of natural pivot point, and so wanted to give folks a chance to weigh in if they wanted to do so. So we often think in our communications that the stories that we have to share are somehow less valid than data. We hear, a lot about how we shouldn't be making policy based on anecdote, how, we've got to be evidence-based, and those things are certainly true in that as the science has evolved to point to new directions for solving critical community problems, it's absolutely essential that our practices and our policy ask incorporate those. But it's also true that stories are tremendously powerful, and they are very valid, just differently so. We use stories for things all the time. I have 4 little children, so I tell stories and hear stories and use stories to teach and to entertain and to comfort and to encourage, and you're probably the same way. In fact, stories are probably a huge part of what brought you to this work, what keeps you in this work, and kind of what you tell yourself about why this work matters and why it's for you. We are interested today in stories that are specifically designed to lead people to action. So we use stories for lots of different things. We want to talk about the types of stories that will get people to think differently, yes, but to think differently so that they will do something differently. Maybe it's change some of their own behavior. Maybe it's talk with policymakers about the need for particular investments in your community. Maybe it's make a financial contribution to support some of your work or volunteer personally. You want to get people changing because you are an initiative and a people that's about community change. So I want to talk about what stories can do for us specifically in our advocacy, about the type of story arc that we're looking for, and the types of stories, the kind of characteristics of stories that will get us there. And then I'll close with a few tools for you to think about, similarly to the message box and the messaging context, that can help you in your own storytelling and story collection. So stories, we want people to move to action. That requires that people be able to actually visualize themselves taking an action. And those of you who are in the behavioral change arena know this very well, but there's a lot of brain research about how priming ourselves for change can increase the likelihood of long-term success with that change. So we use stories to help people imagine their own journey unfolding in the direction in which you want to see it unfold. It's about inviting people to be part of your work by forging a personal connection. And this is one of my favorites. It reduces defensiveness because your story is your own. You know, people may dispute some of your facts, and I've spent way more time than I want to remember engaged in a back and forth debate about evidence on a variety of different social problems. But when I tell my story of what I've lived and what I've experienced, other people may have very different experiences that led them to very different conclusions, but on a fundamental level, they can't entirely negate the validity of my own journey and what I have seen with my own eyes. And I think that I've seen stories used to great effect to kind of break through some of that initial defensiveness. Stories provide inspiration to others and encourage them to tell their stories. It's a way to grow your constituency. So, you know, sharing really important evidence is a strategy for getting people to think differently about your work, and they certainly may share with others some, you know, statistics, some really fantastic outcome. But what we share the most in any venue, from the kind of traditional oral communication to today's newest social media, are stories because they are inherently shareable in a way sometimes the data are not. Stories complement the data that we collect about our work, so it's not about replacing your reliance on evidence and evidence-based practice, but helping people to really understand that evidence and to understand why they should care about it. And then stories increase our own investment, which is probably my second favorite thing about them in the advocacy context. We can use stories to remind us why we do this work and to help to kind of maintain our own engagement during the difficult times that inevitably befall those who are trying to do the tough work of changing communities. Again, the particular type of stories that we want to tell are stories that prime people for action, which are different than stories that we use for entertainment or for instruction or just inspiration. So our stories follow this particular story arc from attention to need to satisfaction to visualization to action. So we get people to listen. We help them to see the problem through our same lens. We help them then to have some hope that that problem can be solved with a particular approach. We then help them see what that solution would look like in their own lives and their own imperatives. And then we give them some very explicit ideas about what they could do to be a part of realizing that vision. And so this can be either visually or just kind of as a part of a mental map for you, a way that you think about the arc that your stories need to follow as you are identifying, collecting, curating, and then ultimately using those stories. So what are the attributes of effective storytelling and of effective stories? Some of this comes from a book that I would encourage you to read if you haven't, by a guy named John Capecci, called Living Proof Storytelling for Advocacy. He visited Kansas actually a few years ago for an event with the Sunflower Foundation. I've had the opportunity to talk and work with him on a couple of different occasions. So some of this is my own adaptation of some of his work, but some of it comes from that very readable book. So effective stories are focused, meaning that you have a clear sense of what your purpose is for telling a given story or for telling a particular cut of a given story. Your story will be less successful if you are trying to accomplish many different purposes with a particular telling of it. Your story should be positively charged. Again, this is where the hope comes in. There has to be something good that can happen, at least, even if it hasn't yet, for a story to really resonate with someone. That doesn't certainly mean that there can't be tragedy, there can't be, difficulty, but again, there has to be that kind of hook of why I should have reason to hope that things could be better. Your story should be crafted, which means that it's flexible. You can condense it into a 2-minute elevator speech, or you can stretch it out a little bit for a longer conversation. And you use a story map or another kind of story preparation exercise to help you figure out how you can slice off pieces of your story in order to make it crafted more along those lines. Your story should be framed. So I ask people to think about this like a frame on a wall, right, which draws your attention to something specific that you want people to look at. So that means that you've thought already about what you want the takeaway, quote unquote, from this story to be, and that you use language and you use pacing and inflection if it's a story you're telling verbally, or images if it's a story that you're telling in print. You use those different storytelling conventions to frame your story and draw people's attention where you want it to be focused. And then your story is practiced. And I get some resistance sometimes from folks who say, but you know, it's our story, and you know, it's her authentic story, or it's my own story, and I know this. I don't need to practice this. And I think what we're really hearing there is this resistance to the idea that we script our stories and that those somehow make that exercise makes them less authentic. So I would say, just by way of reassurance, that it's not at all about making it less than authentic, you know, just as we will prepare for many of the most important communications activities of our lives, whether it's giving a toast for somebody or, you know, exchanging wedding vows. Those expressions are no less sincere because we have given thought ahead of time to what we will say and how we will say it. And our storytelling is really important, too important for us just to wing it. So a few examples of storytelling for advocacy. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of these, but I want to share a couple. So a few years ago, I was doing some work supporting parents who were advocating for early Head Start funding in the Kansas legislature. And I was accompanying a mom who was in the Capitol for the first time, talking with a legislator about her own experiences, or she was just asked to go and ask for funding for early Head Start. And so she, you know, sits down and says her name, and that she's here to talk about early Head Start. And the legislator cut her off and said, you know, I don't even want to hear about early Head Start. I know that Head Start is just a babysitting service so that parents can drop off their kids and go to the mall and shop. And, of course, me being an advocate who's supposed to be supporting her in her advocacy forays here, paralyzed by that, you know, just thinking there couldn't have been anything worse that would happen to discourage this young mom from, you know, making her voice a part of the policy dialogue. And I should not have worried, because what she did was just kind of take a deep breath and say, huh, that hasn't been my experience. So my older son went through Head Start, and I completed my associate's degree. And then when my younger son was able to start the program, I went back and I'll finish my bachelor's degree in May, the same year that he graduates and heads to kindergarten. Period. I'm not at all going to claim that that changed that legislator's view of that program, but I know that he came back with just, oh, well, congratulations to you on finishing your degree, and then let her give her kind of presentation or her, you know, kind of advocacy points about that program. She started with her own narrative in a way that no one could deny, and it not only salvaged what could have been a negative advocacy experience as a chance for her to tell a story that she felt good about, but also allowed some initial development of a relationship with that policymaker, and I would really like to think at least a different lens on an issue and a program that he thought he really knew. I think a more, you know, certainly more high profile, but potentially more immediately relevant to your work issue is the work that Mothers Against Drunk Driving did. Really, the entire structure of that organization started with getting survivors who had lost family members, particularly mothers, but not exclusively, to tell their stories about who they had lost and how, and what that meant to them and to their communities. It was really an example of using stories to break through powerful social norms at the time, science had not caught up yet. The evidence about how alcohol impaired decision-making and response time and driving overall was not nearly where it is today. And so it was really those moms and other family members saying, this is what happened to someone that I love, and this is why I think these laws need to be changed, that allowed a different conversation that subsequently led not only to changes in laws that have been very significant, saving thousands and thousands of lives, but even probably more importantly, changed ideas and changed norms. And then finally, I worked recently with an organization that works with kids who are in foster care, and there was a young man who went through a storytelling training that I did, and he was going to tell his story for a group of donors. And I like this example because it is a good example of how getting support to tell your story can enrich the overall experience. So this was a story that he knew, obviously, he had lived it, and yet the chance that he had to practice this story, which at the very first time he told it, he couldn't even get through it all. It was very emotional for him. To subsequently, telling the story in different iterations, getting affirmation from it, seeing his story unfold in the 6 weeks in between when he got this assignment and when he actually told the story. As he grew in confidence, he then also made strides forward in his life. And when I got the chance to see him actually tell this story, he took the piece of paper where he had scripted it out, folded it up, and put it underneath the podium and told a story that was somewhat different than the one that he had practiced, but entirely authentic and incredibly resonant with the hundreds of people who had assembled to hear it. It was an example of storytelling not just as communication, but really as community change itself, prompting a reconsideration of what these kids are capable of and of what our collective obligation is to and with them. So then some tools that you can consider for increasing your own capacity to tell your story and to identify good stories in those around you. I use a story map with folks a lot. So this is where you think either chronologically or thematically about really what is the story of you, of your coalition, of a particular issue. And then you go through and peel out the pieces that you think knit together well or the pieces that you think you want to tell in this particular context. It helps people a lot with getting over the sense that, like, I have to start in the beginning. Sometimes you do. Sometimes the beginning is a really critical part of what your story is today. And sometimes starting in the beginning just increases the likelihood that you lose people before you get to the most important parts. And this is where, again, having some people who aren't as intimately familiar with your work can be really helpful. But it can be hard to have to go through and take things out that you might otherwise tell. And mapping them out, mapping your stories out visually can help with that a lot. I use an exercise called the 6-word reason that does come from Capecchi's book, Living Proof, so is all credit due to him on this. But I've had the experience of doing this with a lot of different organizations, and it's always really impactful. So the reason for 6 words for me is because it's an arbitrary constraint on your communication, and our lives in communicating about advocacy and social change are nothing if not arbitrary constraints. But it has to be 6 words, and I'm really asking you to think about, why this work, why this issue, what matters the most, what if you could only communicate one thing to people about this work, what would it be? And then giving you a chance to share those with people with whom you're working closely, I think can also increase the cohesion and the kind of sense of shared narrative. I'll talk about storytelling and collection systems in just a minute, but that collective narrative is really important too. I've helped a lot of organizations kind of write the story of who we are. What is our story? Why did we come together? Why do we think that we matter? In some organizations, those are kind of origin stories. In other cases, they become a kind of expression of the vision or the mission of the organization. But I think that going through the exercise of thinking about, who are we and why do we matter can be really helpful for organizations to chart out how they will build on what they have been and where they have been to drive toward where they want to go. And then I think it's really important that organizations or coalitions become really intentional about collecting and using stories. I see all too often that organizations tell the same stories over and over because they aren't keeping good track of which stories they're using. They tell stories in places where they don't make a lot of sense and they don't have good data to go back and then analyze which stories worked where and under what conditions. They don't have good systems of informed consent, so they don't use stories because they're not sure if it's okay to. They can't find stories when they need them. So they get a call from somebody in the press and they say, we need a story about somebody who is using this trail, or somebody who, an employer who instituted new wellness policies, and they think, I know that's happening, but who was it who told me something, and they don't know how to get their hands on them. So the good news is that these do not have to be complicated at all. I work with some organizations that have filing systems, just like a paper file. It's a manila folder, and it's labeled, stories about experiences in foster care for a mental health organization, for example, or, stories about our job training program for an organization with a lot of different social services. And they just stick notes, or, I've helped some organizations to develop an intake form for stories, and they stick them in there. Other organizations have created like an access database, and they have different tags that they use for their different stories. That has the advantage, if you have access to that technology, that you can then embed your informed consent forms right in there, sometimes even embed a picture of the person, or a short audio file of the person telling a piece of their story. Those can get a little bit slick, but even if you don't have that technology, or not everybody has access to it, there are a lot of really low or no tech ways. The key is that you're thinking about it. You're being really deliberate about saying that stories matter. You're communicating that to everybody who interfaces with potential stories on behalf of your organization. And then you're keeping some track of what stories you're using, for what, with whom, and how well they're working. And I have seen organizations be able to really increase the attention that they get, and the extent to which people are buying into their message through the power of narrative, which is a really important element of how we view a lot in our world. So the last is my contact information. As I said, I certainly would be happy. We have time. We have the line still for quite a while. If folks have additional questions or comments, or we want to open it up for some discussion. But I also am happy to be a resource outside of the context of this webinar as well, if that would be helpful.
And Melinda, we do have a couple of questions and comments. And
great.
One is if you could repeat again the name of the book,
oh, sure.
the full name of the book, and the author, if you have the spelling of the last name as well, that'd probably be helpful.
That I do. It's actually right here in front of me because I keep it on my bookshelf. I refer to it sometimes for some different examples. So it's called Living Proof, Telling Your Story to Make a Difference. And the author is John Capecci, which is C-A-P-E-C-C-I. And it's a really quick read. There are pieces of it that I don't use, and there are some pieces of how I approach storytelling that are a little bit different than what he's used, but it's really a valuable book. I don't think very expensive and easy to read.
Great, great. And then the other comment was from a participant, and they just said, I have to sign off early, but I wanted to pass on that I found this webinar very thought-provoking and useful. and I will be sharing, out this information with Heartland Healthy Neighborhoods in Topeka and using this information. So thank you so much for making it available to us. That was the other comment.
Great. Great to hear.
And so far, there are no other questions or chats open. We'll give a moment if anyone has any further questions. Okay, I do have a comment here. The 6-word exercise is a powerful tool I've experienced in several groups, and it's a great way to focus individually and as a group. So another comment.
Great. No, I feel the same way. In fact, I just had a chance to do it at the end of last week with a group of youth volunteers who are working on a kind of anti-substance use campaign in their local community. And it was really cool to see there were some adults and a lot of youth in the conversation, and to see how much common ground there was in terms of what brought them to this work, but also to see what it meant for each of them to hear each other's reasons for being a part of this work. So it's an exercise I've probably used 100 times, but every time you do it with a different group, it really is a little bit different, and it was really fun to see how they took it.
And we have another question. Do you work with individual coalitions to help gather and write stories?
Do I do that? Is that the question?
That was,
so I have done work not so much with individual coalitions, but I do some work through my consulting to different advocacy and nonprofit organizations, some of which comes through the advocacy evaluation collaborative that Jeff mentioned. So one of the things that we're evaluating with some groups is their kind of media advocacy efforts and helping them identify indicators of the increasing salience of their messages. And so story work is a part of that. And then I also do an advocacy capacity building initiative that is supported by the REACH Foundation and the Healthcare Foundation of Greater Kansas City. And a component of that is doing individualized technical assistance to organizations around advocacy. So in the context of both of those initiatives, I do have the opportunity to work more individually with organizations. That would certainly be something I'd be happy to talk with folks about, to the extent to which in some cases I have some tools already ready-made that might be of use to you. I would love to share that. Obviously my capacity to work in depth with any given organization is somewhat limited, but I'd certainly be happy to talk with folks about what your needs are, and if I or somebody else that I know of might be able to support some of that work.
Great. At this point, I don't see any other questions or comments. So I'd like to just thank you so much, Melinda. I mean, this has been, just to echo the sentiments of the other participants, just a fantastic presentation to allow people to really understand, how to best communicate their message and their story. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a lot of fun.
Great. And just a couple of closing announcements. As Adrian mentioned before, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on SharePoint within the next several days. Also, you'll be receiving via an email a link to a short survey to obtain your feedback about the webinar. So we'll be using this information to plan for upcoming events and webinars. So thank you so much for that feedback. Also, the semi-monthly reporting forms are due tomorrow, January 15th. And then lastly, just a reminder that Live Well Finney County will be hosting a Healthy Community Design Summit, and that will be on February 3rd in Garden City. And Mark Fenton will be the keynote speaker, talking about key principles of healthy community design. And we'll also have Mary Merrill from the Public Health Law Center talking about Ready, Aim, Implement. So again, the folks from Garden City just wanted to be able to pass that information on to you, and you should receive the flyer with registration information as well. So that's it in terms of our announcements. So once again, just want to thank all of you for your participation today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.